Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. It's truly an honor to present to you today. So what I'd like to do is offer some reflections, and I understand that I have been given remote access. There we go. To talk about an issue that is very near and dear to my heart, which is how we think about and address inequities in human services. One of the questions that is central to my work is the following. How do human beings improve their lives after individual, institutional, or structural trauma? Traumas that we all are aware of, have investigated, deal with on a day-to-day basis. How do human beings improve their lives in the wake of that? And what organizational systems and conditions best support transformative change? That's really the question at the heart of my work. And I've explored these questions through two key texts. First, the New Welfare Bureaucrats, which I'm going to talk about at the end of the talk just briefly, which is a study of the welfare system in Massachusetts. And then in the current book, Remaking a Life, How Women Living with HIV Think About and Confront Inequality. One of the things that was really central to this project is the following. I interviewed many women living with HIV, over 100 women in Chicago who were living with HIV. And I talked to a woman named Dawn who was diagnosed with HIV at the age of 35. Dawn and I spoke several times, and a quote that she shared with me resonated and became a central question for me. She explained during one of our interviews, if it weren't for HIV, I'd probably be dead. As you can imagine, that's a shocking quote. How can an illness, HIV/AIDS, responsible for the deaths of over 30 million people around the globe, be credited by Dawn for helping to save her life? What I would learn about Dawn in terms of her history of childhood sexual trauma, growing up in a neighborhood of limited economic resources, limited healthcare resources, a woman who had struggled with homelessness and addiction, a woman who had absolutely grappled with trauma at the individual level, at the institutional level, and at the structural level all her life, was saying something very critical to me in that moment, because what she was saying was, if it weren't for the HIV community, I'd probably be dead. If it weren't for the housing that I was able to get access to for women living with HIV, I'd probably be dead. If it wasn't for the drug and alcohol rehabilitative services that I was able to get access to, I would probably be dead. If it weren't for the case management services that I was able to get access to, that helped me navigate institutional systems and get access to services, I'd probably be dead. If it weren't for the support groups, if it weren't for the access to therapy, if it weren't for the peer mentors, talking to women who had walked a similar path as I had walked, who were guides and advisors in my process, who told me that I was not alone and who were there for me and who stood by me, I would probably be dead. So what became really apparent to me in talking to women living with HIV in Chicago and doing a larger study of the HIV Safety Net and how it operates nationally, is that the HIV community has built a quite effective safety net, not perfect, but effective. We often think of the HIV safety net as a healthcare focused system. We think about policies like the Ryan White Care Act. We think about the ways that it gives people access to doctors and nurses and other medical providers, helps them to diagnose their status, gives them access to drug therapies. But in fact, the HIV safety net is much broader. In fact, it is an entire network that helps people move from what I call dying from to living with to thriving despite injuries of inequality. Those big and small wounds to individuals that are wrought by systematic and intersectional marginalization. The ways in which people move through the world and carry traumas with them, both seen and unseen. Because what Dawn was telling me as she discussed her story was that, yes, when she received her HIV diagnosis, she thought it was a death sentence. She grappled with stigma, she grappled with shame, and she grappled with the circumstances that led to her acquiring HIV. But Dawn was dying from many other things. She was dying from racism and poverty and sexism and a whole host of other challenges that were rendering her life expendable. In the HIV safety net, by connecting to that community, she was able to move from living with, which I characterize as a place of basic economic and social and health stability, to a place of thriving despite, where not only is she at a place of stability, but she's able to see some level of mobility. Mobility in terms of helping people become leaders in their communities, helping people understand that they have something to offer to the world, helping people get to stronger economic stability and stronger social stability and stronger stability in their health. So as a sociologist, when I think about mobility, yes, I'm concerned about upward mobility, but I'm also concerned about movement in terms of dying from to living with to thriving despite. We all have clients that we've no doubt worked with that are in these different phases. And while I draw this as a linear depiction on the screen, we know that it's not in fact linear in real life. There are fits and starts, movements back and forth. Sometimes this process can take years. In fact, it took Dawn over a decade to get to a place where she was what I would call thriving despite her HIV status. So I offer this framework as a potential path and a potential framework for understanding client processes in the book. What is it about the HIV safety net that I think is so effective? Again, not perfect, but nevertheless effective and able to offer us some models. The HIV safety net, a global network of health and social service providers, activists, advocates, researchers, and policymakers have operationalized the HIV response on the ground level. Yes, they are focused on providing healthcare, but they also think it's critically important to offer people access to economic assistance, whether it's access to employment training, often access to government disability benefits. Also thinking about social support and taking that very seriously, creating a case management system, creating a very strong peer support system, creating support groups and opportunities for people to be in conversation with each other to help troubleshoot and navigate challenges. So the institutional relationship that an individual may have is not just between caseworker and client. It's about actually clients working with each other, communicating with each other, helping each other and supporting each other and offering social support that so many individuals are often lacking, and particularly lacking in terms of the kind of support that is going to lead to the kind of mobility from dying from to living with to thriving despite as people navigate struggle. But then finally, what I call the secret sauce of the HIV safety net is its very clear focus on political and civic engagement. This has its roots in HIV activism, in the early work of HIV activists who understood that it is absolutely critical that people who are experiencing the condition have a voice at the table and have a seat at the table to help determine what services look like, how policies will be implemented, and how destinies will be shaped. So thinking about how we move clients from dying from to living with to thriving despite is also about helping individuals tell their own stories and use their own voices for the betterment of policy and the betterment of institutional practices. The other piece that I think is really critical here to note is the really important way in which HIV activists are invited to the table. And I have to say, in my work as a welfare researcher and coming into the HIV community, this was one of the biggest points of excitement for me, and one of the biggest distinctions that I saw: the heavy use of advocates and activists at the table, helping to shape policy conversations and helping to shape conversations in terms of what's happening programmatically. So I just wanted to feature some of the people doing this work in the HIV community. What does it mean for people on the ground? Well, what you see in front of you is our snapshot study. We had a study within a study where we talked to 84 women living with HIV in Chicago. You see the racial breakdown, and we asked women, how often do you connect to how many connections do you have to HIV focused agencies, groups, or healthcare providers? And do you have these kinds of visits at least once every 1 to 3 months? And what we expected to see was high engagement among women, perhaps as it relates to medical care, in terms of seeing doctors, getting access to medications. So we weren't surprised to see that 82% of our respondents said, yes, I do have these interactions at least once every 1 to 3 months. But what surprised us is how women talked about the kinds of interactions. Only 25% were using the HIV safety net for its most obvious purpose, healthcare access. In fact, the majority of women were using the HIV safety net for both healthcare services, but also social services, getting access to economic assistance and social support assistance, but also using it to politically and civically connect to a community of people that were helping women speak truth to power, to help women to use their voices. So what was very intriguing to me is what you see in the box there, or the rectangle there, the ways in which 57% of our respondents were using the HIV safety net much more holistically than what we had realized. And you see the racial differences there, particularly among Black women and their heavy use of the HIV safety net. Black women are disproportionately affected by the HIV epidemic. They are the majority of women living with HIV in the United States. And it's noteworthy in terms of how they're plugging into this community and how they're using the services. This was very different from what I experienced studying, say, the welfare system, which was the subject of the New Welfare Bureaucrats book. And I think there's some key differences in terms of that are critical for us to note here. Part of it is about the kinds of services that are available. Part of it is about the history of how these services came to be. But there's some important cultural and structural dynamics that I think can and should be replicated. First, the emphasis on client storytelling and peer support as valuable organizational assets. Too often, we have a history where human services do not draw out client stories. And if they do, they're often used for surveillance purposes. Studying the new women on public assistance through the New Welfare Bureaucrats, it was commonly known that women didn't want to share their stories with their welfare caseworkers, that they wanted to be as limited as possible in the information that they provided, because the ethos there was around making sure that people weren't defrauding the system, that they weren't getting access to more benefits to which they were entitled. So that set up a kind of interaction where women didn't share. Very, very distinct in the HIV system, where women are encouraged to share, where it's not necessarily used in terms of anything that you say can and will be used against you, but in terms of helping women connect to their stories, and then further connect to their services, to understand how they can be authors in their own lives, and also to use peer support, to have women share stories with each other, and to see that as a valuable organizational asset, not as an add-on that is critical for the work of these institutions. The second thing that is really critical is the notion of accountability. We often think about accountability as hierarchical. We think about the policies, we think about the state institutions, and we think about what's happening on the ground. The HIV community has figured out that accountability also has to be horizontal and has to come from the ground up. There's a phrase that you often hear called "nothing about us without us." No meetings, no conversations, no policy recommendations, no programmatic changes without people of the lived experience sitting at the table. And in fact, it is one of the things that was so noteworthy when I began studying the HIV system is, as I began to come to meetings like these, it would be unheard of for someone who is living with HIV not to be in the conversation, not to be at the table. And what that does to enforce equity and inclusion is transformative. It is built-in accountability where we are sitting side by side, talking about policy, talking about programs with the people who are going to be most directly impacted. So one of the things that I want to put on the table for us today is how often we bring these communities to the table in these kinds of conversations. And what would it mean for us to do that in terms of heightening the level of accountability and increasing and expanding expanding equity. The final thing that I'll say as I conclude is the following, as I kind of pull all of these ideas and thoughts together. One of the things that I want to offer are 5 different ideas that I'll just leave you with that kind of sum up what I've offered. In the relationship between support and surveillance, what we measure is what we incentivize. Critically important to measure, we know that, but we've got to think about how we're striking that balance institutionally between the support functionality of what we do and the surveillance functionality of what we do. Client voice and policy formation and implementation is an accountability tool, as I talked about, nothing about us without us. Trauma-informed care is an equity strategy that challenges the narrative of the quote unquote difficult client by informing trauma-informed care, by talking to people about their experiences and helping to understand how that shapes how they navigate institutions. We can push back on that narrative that too often circulates within our bureaucracies of the difficult client. Holistic services help to address injuries of inequality. When I think about what moves people from dying from to living with to thriving despite, it's that holistic framework of thinking about healthcare, economic support, social support, and civic engagement simultaneously. And finally, representation matters, and so does staff training. I am a firm believer that while the HIV Safety Net has a very distinct history, there are nevertheless aspects of its culture that can be translated in other human service venues. So it's critical that we think about who we bring to the table, but also how we're training the folks at the table. Thank you.